Welcome, everyone. My name is Andrew Burt. I am managing partner of BNH.AI, boutique law firm focused on AI, chief legal officer at Immuta, and a visiting fellow at Yale Law's Information Society project. I'm pleased to be here today moderating this session on regulation. And first up speaking is a keynote that's going to be presented by Dr. David Magnus. The keynote is focused on beyond regulation, ethical oversight, and governance of AI. And just one sentence background on Dr. Magnus before I hand it over to him. Dr. Magnus is a professor of medicine and biomedical ethics, professor of pediatrics, medicine, and by courtesy of bioengineering at Stanford, where he directs the Stanford Center for Biomedical Ethics and is an associate dean of research. He's clearly tremendously qualified, and I'm excited to hear what he has to say. So with that, over to you, Dr. Magnus.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I'm looking forward to sharing information with colleagues. Hopefully, our talks today will be as stimulating as the wonderful presentations we had earlier today. I have no financial conflicts of interest. Obviously, there's going to be some other presentations that talk a little bit about this. And for those who attended the AME meeting yesterday, there was some talk about regulation. The primary vehicles of regulation of AI as it's used in medicine is through the FDA or through common rule regulations for human subjects research, and both wind up pointing down to the role that IRBs play in oversight of human subjects and the protection of those. When you actually look at our current regulatory system and the IRB system, its origins in Helsinki in the 60s and in the Belmont a couple decades later, the focus was really on risk to subjects, not society, as the primary ethical concern. And so if you look at what IRBs do following the regulatory requirements that came out of that period, they're really focused on making sure that risks to subjects are minimized and are reasonable in relation to anticipated benefits of research, ensuring that there's informed consent. Theoretically, they're supposed to also ensure equitable subject selection, although that may not be as much of a focus of IRBs in practice. And I say that as somebody who's co-chair of one IRB, the NIH Precision Medicine All of Us Research Program IRB, as well as a member of Stanford's IRB. But what IRBs don't do is really think about the longer term downstream impacts on society of a technology development. And in fact, not only is that something that IRBs typically don't do, it's something that they're actually prohibited from doing under the regulations. The common rule states that the IRB should not consider possible long-range effects of applying knowledge gained in the research, such as the possible effects of research on public policy, as among those research risks that fall within the purview of its responsibility. So the downstream impact of AI is outside the purview of the IRB. So what IRBs and our current regulations really don't do very much is really specify how to address long-term societal impacts. There are also specific issues that are often left open and unaddressed, like what particular results from research should be returned rather than not returned. And a lot of effort has gone into developing principles for AI and for ethical conduct of AI. And it just feels like we've got so many principles. We've got all the principles we could want, but there's very little that ensures that those principles are widely or ideally universalized, operationalized in the actual conduct of AI research and development. So what are some possible solutions? So one solution might be expand the IRB focus from just focused on the protection of research subjects to think about downstream implications. So that's one possibility. It is, however, not a very good idea. Christine Hine, in a paper that she published that evaluated the use of what in the UK they call ethics governance, ethical review committees, when she actually explored this, found that the relatively narrow focus of those committees made them really ill prepared to actually look at those downstream issues and to consider them very well. Moreover, there is a tendency to turn the review process in IRBs appropriately so, into a compliance function and a highly bureaucratized one, as opposed to an ethical one, which leaves them really ill-suited to really carry out what's really needed for oversight in this area and for improvements in this area. So if IRBs can't do this job, are there non-IRB governance structures that might play a role? Well, several have been proposed. In one proposal, the approach was proposed to use peer review processes as a way of having an impact by saying that peer reviewers should require proposals include rigorous considerations of negative and positive broad impact. So have the impacts, downstream impacts of research be among the things that are considered in the review process. And that could be part of the grant review process, which I'll give an illustration of in a little bit, or potentially in the publication process. And then along the similar lines, NeurIPS chairs decided as part of their conference that they would actually require essentially an ethics statement in which the downstream implications of their research were actually identified as part of the review process for submitting for the NeurIPS conference. Although it should be noted that the actual ethics statement, although it was required, played no role in the decision about what was going to be reviewed, presented, and accepted for presentation and what would not. Those researchers also followed up with surveys of the people who actually went through that process. They didn't have a very good response rate, but it was still interesting that among the people who filled out the response to the surveys, there was a pretty wide range about how challenging people found this process. And even more interestingly was respondents' view on whether framing the requirement as a statement of broader concern was a good way of framing the requirement. And as you can see, a majority of the people felt this was actually not a very good approach to the problem. Another problem with this approach is that even if it does a good job of getting people to start to think about the broader societal implications of their research, it doesn't do anything to actually address it. If all they have to do is say, here's what could happen, this research, while it has some very valuable things, could be misused by bad actors in totalitarian governments to spy on people in the populace. That's not really very helpful unless there's some proposal and some approach to figuring out at the level of the design and early on the development process how to make efforts to try and mitigate those harms and address them. So I think we need to move beyond this to broader views of governance. The Alan Turing Institute, in their report, laid out a comprehensive approach to artificial intelligence ethics and safety, and how to design and implement AIs for the public sector that would meet high standards. They did have a little bit of time and effort on governance for ensuring that all these wonderful frameworks that they developed would actually be implemented, and they actually helpfully identify some spaces where a process-based governance framework for AI could evaluate different components of the workflow. So it's in a way an idealized design of what a process-based governance framework ought to look like. But there wasn't really a proposal for how to actually implement something like that. Potentially that could be voluntary, or in which case it may be the proposals that need it the most, or the projects that need it the most, it might be missing. But in any case, that next step of what to do to fill that gap needs to be made. One attempt to try and not necessarily do all the things expressed there, but at least some of them, was something some colleagues and I have done at Stanford, which is something that we've called the Ethics and Society Review, or Ethical and Societal Review of Artificial Intelligence Research. Michael Bernstein deserves a lot of the credit for leading us. Margaret Levy and myself and Deborah Satz are the other faculty co-chairs. And some of the work that I'm going to be describing, a lot of this was led by Michael and two staff members at the Center for Advanced Studies, Betsy and Charla. And so Michael, Margaret, Deborah, and I co-chair this effort, and Betsy and Charla have really been instrumental in carrying out follow-up research and evaluation of what we've been doing. And this all comes out of something that Stanford has called the Stanford Human-Centered AI Institute, or HI, and really making the ethical and societal review process part of their process. And the idea is that when people apply to HI for grant funding, when they turn in all the other usual parts of their grant application, their goals, their aims, their methods, they also have to include a description of some of the downstream ethical implications and societal implications of their work, and how they would plan to mitigate any potential future harms or risks to society if they were able to successfully carry out the research that they're trying to do. So they put in those statements. Then there's the standard merit review for funding by the program. The proposals that actually are good enough to get funded, and the program says we will fund all of these projects, then go to the ESR panel for review. And then at that point, rather than just a thumbs up or thumbs down, we give feedback. And sometimes that feedback actually requires iteration between us and the researchers who have put in the proposal. And then we eventually make a recommendation to funding for the program. And it's important to note that in this process, what we're doing is quite distinct from the role of the Institutional Review Board. We are not attempting to just duplicate what the IRBs already carry out and do. That can sometimes be challenging when you look at a research project that you think raises human subjects research that you hope the IRB is addressing. That's always a fraught issue for any kinds of non-IRB scientific or other review process that goes along with IRB review of a research protocol. But we really try to restrict our focus to really making sure that before funding takes place, that the broader societal issues have been addressed adequately. In the first year of the program, when we piloted this, we started off with 6 very large grants in the 7-figure range of multi-million-dollar grants, and reviewed all of those. Then we later expanded to look at 35 smaller seed grants in the amount of, I think it's about $100,000 a year. All 6 large grants and 10 of the seed grants were asked to iterate based on our feedback. 3 of the seed grants were actually asked to iterate multiple times. All were eventually approved for funding. Now, Michael and the team sent out a survey to all the seed grant recipients. And one of the things that was striking was that people were willing to engage in this process again. All of them were willing to engage in the process again. But interestingly, most of them said that they would do so voluntarily, even if it was not a requirement, which you'd think that having to write something and go through this process, who wants more review? But actually, people thought this was useful enough that they said that it's something that they would want to do again. 67% of the researchers who iterated with this process and 58% of all the researchers felt that the ethics and society review process had actually influenced the design of their project. So it does appear that what we actually did made a difference to what kind of thing was happening, what kind of research they were proposing and how they did it. In some qualitative follow-ups that were conducted, I'm going to just give a couple of quotes to illustrate this. The ESR requirement led me to engage with my co-PI because as a psychologist, I wasn't aware of some of the potential ethical implications that this AI work may have, and it helped me to engage with my co-PI as part of this requirement. And I really love this quote. In fact, we might flip our whole research approach to being about privacy. The pretty strong reaction from the ESR made us rethink to lead with privacy. We don't have answers yet, but it's definitely helped us think about a better way to approach the research, how we're doing it, and how we're talking about it. Interestingly, most of the researchers, when they were asked to self-identify in their statement the research problems or issues that they thought their research raised, the vast majority of them identified representativeness as a major issue. And indeed, the ESR review panelists agreed that representativeness was an important issue. But there were other issues that were also important. Dual use, the way in which the AI that was developed might be used in other hands in ways that are not intended and might be used negatively, the importance of stakeholder involvement in the design process, and then harms to subgroups, potential harms to subgroups. You can see that our panelists most commonly raised new risks that the researchers had not described in their statement, and then secondly, deepened some of the themes that researchers had already raised. So 26 times identified new risks and 22 times deepened the conversations. And so you can see that both of these were, I think, valuable activities by the panel. Interestingly, when asked whether we should be empaneled to reject proposals, the general trend from researchers was that was appropriate, that we should be empowered to reject proposals if necessary. Though, of course, the goal through that iteration process is that all of the proposals and all the research should be adequately address the problem sufficiently to be able to go forward. Now, there are some limitations that we've definitely experienced from this effort as we're starting to ramp this up, both for the second year for high and also start to do something similar for some other grant funding that's happening elsewhere at Stanford with Stanford funding. One is scalability. And in fact, just shifting from the first 6 large grants to the 35 grant proposals required a pretty significant shift in the way we operated. The 4 co-chairs together, we were able to work together to evaluate all 6 of those large grants. But once we had 35 proposals come in that we had to review, the 4 of us could not review 35 proposals and go through this process. So we had to add other people, and one of the 4 of us chaired all of the smaller subgroups who would evaluate those 35 proposals. But that does create the potential for greater heterogeneity. If that number goes from 35 to 350, that will be even harder to scale. If it goes up to 3,500, now we're talking about a tremendous challenge to be able to scale this. And that's just a small drop in the bucket of even the Stanford funded research that takes place at Stanford. The risk that at scale, efforts will become compliance when we go to 350 or to 500 or 1,000, that we'll be doing a compliance rather than substantive ethics is, I think, a significant risk. A possible solution, and one of the things that we heard in feedback from the researchers was the importance of scaffolding and providing them with adequate scaffolding in filling out the required ethics sheets that they were turning in. So they really thought the more that we gave them scaffolding for what to look for as they were thinking through the ethical challenges, the better prepared they felt and the more valuable and useful it would be for them. So it's also the case from our side of things that the greater the scaffolding, the easier the review and the less iterations hopefully will have to take place. And we're trying some other measures like having a very cursory, both more scaffolding and a preliminary review from staff to decide which ones require even more substantive review from faculty is something we're implementing to try and become more scalable. There was also the perception that researchers would benefit from more ongoing coaching and detailed interaction, which is not really possible through a governance process like this. Even if we require annual review and annually interact with them, that's still just a snapshot rather than some of the kind of ongoing coaching and interaction that some of the researchers in interviews actually said they thought would be valuable and is beyond the scope of what any kind of governance structure like this could really achieve. So another option and another program that we've got at Stanford to try and fill some of that gap is through research ethics consultation. And this was a science article that was published an Nature article was published 15 years ago about our program and a few others, but featured our research, new research ethics consultation service. Research ethics consultation has an interesting history. Clinical ethics consultation in the hospital has been in place for over 3 decades. And, I spent 15 years as chair of our hospital's ethics committee and have extensive experience and still conduct research, clinical ethics consults. Research ethics consults have mostly been either informal consultations or outgrowths of those clinical ethics consultations. But their last decade or decade and a half, there's been a lot of programmatic effort to really create services to conduct research ethics consultation throughout the country. And the Clinical Translational Science Award Program has been a big boost to that program. And there's a little bit of data that's been collected on some of those programs. We proposed this program at Stanford in 2003, piloted it from 2000 2005 to 2010, and now we've got a very well-developed and one of the most robust research ethics consultation services in the country, funded out of our CTSA program. We have published a number of articles about research ethics consultation and our experience at Stanford with this consultation. This was a paper that we published in the American Journal of Bioethics. Here's another one we published in IRB. We have other publications. We have another piece published in Science Translational Medicine. One of the things we found was that what we were asked to do covered a pretty wide range of activities: assist in research design, how to deal with incidental findings, help draft responses to funding agencies who have particular questions about ethics, advise on ethical literature on particular topics, as well as some of the things we've been talking about here: a long-term examination of a difficult and controversial topic that requires extensive research. And some of those things actually can be just some considerations, but often require actual collaborations. And we have published quite a large number of articles coming out of our collaborative work on addressing ethical issues that arose during our consultation service. Just to give a couple of cases, this is a very early case study and was a precursor to our program. Back when I and my colleague Mildred Cho were at Penn, we're now both at Stanford, we had been involved in a research ethics consult that was called to us from something called the Institute for Genome Research, for Genome Research, Tiger, that was then headed by Craig Venter. And they were doing work on trying to figure out what the minimal number of genes necessary for being alive were. And to really show that it worked, they were planning on actually synthesizing the minimal genome to show that their model worked and that this was the minimal number of genes necessary for being alive. And this was something we started in 97. We published this paper in Science in 99 to accompany one of their more technical scientific articles. And it's important to remember, back at that period, the language of dual use did not exist. The NSABB did not exist. It was pre 9/11, and synthetic biology did not exist. There was no such thing as synthetic biology. So this is, I think, a good example of thinking through downstream issues from very, very early on. And what's nice about the fact that we did that consult now is the world has changed so dramatically since 1999 that we published in this space. And we were looking forward to thinking about some of those downstream issues. So what were the concerns that we talked about? We talked about the potential ecological impact of new synthesized organisms that might be created, the potential for, we didn't call it dual use because that was not part of the lexicon at the time, but we talked about the dual use of using different language. We talked about dual use potential of the technology, that this might be used by bad actors or bioterrorists. We talked about patenting and IP issues. We also worried about overhype and how the research was being described, even describing it as the scientific answer to what is life, when it was really only focusing on the genes and not the rest of the cell, was in some ways misleading and might mislead the public about its significance, when researchers describing their work say that they were envisioning that extinction might become a thing of the past. That is very worrisome and a very reductionist picture that's really quite potentially problematic. Similarly, we've identified implications for abortion politics by overhyping of this is all life is. So we found that calling these things the minimal the genes or the things necessary to life was a valuable heuristic, but not necessarily the final word, and put in some guidance about some language to use in describing their work for the public. The big value of this played out a few years later when the first virus was actually synthesized, and then even still later, a decade later, the first organism. And it really created the beginnings of a whole research literature and a whole set of considerations for how to evaluate and govern and this kind of research. And I think it holds up pretty well to the test of time and shows how you can actually do some of this successfully. Although at the time, I think we did not quite anticipate the creation of foundries and all the other things that have wound up being created in the space of synthetic biology. One other case, this one is more recent. We were initially consulted and wound up collaborating with Fei Li and Kevin Schulman and Arnie Milstein and other colleagues around ambient intelligence in healthcare system. This is where you use different kinds of sensors in the health setting combined with AI that would operate on those things. So for example, you might have thermal sensors that can detect whether or not when people are walking into patient rooms, they're washing their hands scans or not, or for patients who are at home, whether they're at increased risk of falling, and the use of AI to be able to make those identifications combined with this kind of sensing. And we worked with them for quite a bit of time and wound up publishing in Lancet Digital Health an entire ethical framework for thinking through the ethical issues that arose in their research. None of the things that we identified are particularly surprising in a lot of ways, but again, it highlights the value of the fact that this research team, as they're conducting their research, were seriously thinking about all of these potential implications and things that they had to think through as they were moving forward in their research. Now, what are the challenges to the consultation model? It is time consuming and very expensive. Our CTSA program is spending well over $150,000 a year for our consultation service, and we're already straining to meet the current need as it's growing. It may not be enough, and it takes many, many hours per week to be able to actually carry this out. So all of these scalability concerns really highlight the fact that what we really need more than anything else is a change in culture. Regulation, oversight, governance, consultation all have their important place, but ultimately they're all hopefully part or a piece of culture change. One of the things that we are hoping with the ESR model is that if we do this once and people have been given the scaffolding to see how they ought to frame thinking through issues, and they learn how to think about mitigating those concerns in the design process from very early on, that they will take that knowledge with them in all the other research they do. And that's really what we need to do to try to promulgate this. And maybe their trainees will start to do this, and maybe their colleagues will learn from them to do this. But shifts in culture and consideration of ethical and equity issues is really the most important factor, and highlight and come back to the really important point, which is ultimately researcher integrity in thinking through and recognizing all these downstream implications is ultimately the most important protection that we have. There's a false history of research ethics, which is that research subjects had little to no protection for most of the 20th century. That Henry Beecher's classic 1966 New England Journal of Medicine article showed that a great deal of human subjects research lacked informed consent, and that we needed more oversight to enforce consent, which combined with abuses like Tuskegee and Willowbrook gave rise to the current protectionist system with informed consent and independent oversight as the key pillars. This is a false history. Here's what Beecher actually said. In spite of the fact that he said that people should be striving for informed consent, he thought they should be striving for it even if when it's unachievable. So he didn't think it was the most important protection. He thought the striving for it was a protection. Why? Because a far more dependable safeguard than consent is the presence of a truly responsible investigator. And striving for that consent is a sign that they're responsible. And secondly, in addition to informed consent, there is the more reliable safeguard provided by the presence of an intelligent, informed, conscientious, compassionate, responsible investigator. That's really what we're looking for. We want our AI researchers and developers to be intelligent, informed, conscientious, compassionate, and responsible. So we tend, when we think about this from a regulatory point of view, to really think about this in terms of compliance. We've started to move in the direction in governance of thinking about broadening that to thinking about ethics more and broader concepts of integrity and respect. But ultimately, the end goal that we're really aiming at is trustworthiness and an enterprise in which the public can trust the developers of AI tools in medicine to be doing the right thing and to doing their best to really make sure everybody's protected, to be good stewards of the data, and so on, and some of the things that you heard about earlier today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Magnus. That was wonderful. And in addition, you were exactly on time. In fact, 1 minute early, which is a rare event. So thank you. Next up on the agenda, I'm going to pull up Dr. Sahiner's bio, if I can pull it up here. Next up is Berkman Sahiner, Dr. Sahiner, who is a senior biomedical research scientist with the Office of Science and Engineering Laboratories at the Center for Devices and Radiological Health at the FDA. Dr. Sahiner is going to talk about ethical considerations for regulation of AI-enabled devices in radiology. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Dr. Sahiner.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So let's wait for a minute till I put my Slides up. Okay. Thanks again for the introduction. My name is Berkman Sahiner, and my talk is titled Ethics Considerations for Regulation of AI-Enabled Devices in Radiology. And let me say how thrilled I am to be a part of this session. First, to give you some idea about the source of my perspective, I'm not bold, meaning that I'm neither a bioethicist nor a lawyer, nor do I have data to share, but I'm part of AIR, that is AI in radiology and more specifically regulation. So from me, you will hear perspectives of a researcher and scientist who previously worked on AI design in radiology and who is currently actively involved with regulation of AI-enabled radiological devices. So to give you a little bit more about my perspective, I would also like to briefly mention the mission and vision of the center that I work for at the FDA, Center for Device and Radiological Health. And I know that sometimes these mission vision statements are listened to as more yada, 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 but these principles are really what we believe in at CDRH. And what I'm going to say is closely related to ethics. The mission of CDRH includes protecting and promoting the health of the public by ensuring the safety and effectiveness of medical devices. So our focus is public health and medical devices, which of course includes AI-enabled devices. And the first sentence in our vision reads, patients in the US have access to high quality, safe, and effective medical devices of public health importance first in the world. And this is to highlight the equal importance we give to safety and effectiveness, but also the timely transition of the developed devices from the bench to the market. And this is very relevant to AI-enabled medical devices because we see an ever-increasing number of such devices, especially in radiology, that can improve public health when they are quickly moved from the lab to the market, but that might also raise new questions of safety and effectiveness because they are so novel. I will next talk about the application of the mission and vision of CDRH to some of fundamental principles in ethics and bioethics, including veracity, non-maleficence, beneficence, and justice, among others. Of course, these first three, veracity, non-maleficence, beneficence, and justice, are fundamental principles introduced by Tom Beauchamp and James Childress in their very influential book, Principles of Biomedical Ethics. The last principle from that book, respect for autonomy, is also very relevant in the discussion today. And there is a particularly strong link to AI through patient consent and privacy and data sharing. This was discussed in earlier sessions and by Dr. Magnus earlier in this session, so I will not spend much time on it, except to say that sponsors and applicants to the FDA are required to provide statements regarding the conformity of investigations with good clinical practice when clinical data is submitted in support of device applications and submissions. I'll start with veracity, or confirming to facts and accuracy. This is an important ethics concept that the FDA tries to make sure sponsors of AI-enabled devices adhere to. So when there is a claim in the indications for use or other documents such as summary of safety and effectiveness or device labeling, we make sure that these are carefully reviewed and scrutinized by the FDA. For example, let's take this first bullet point at the bottom about the standalone performance of an AI-enabled computer-assisted detection device for bone fractures. The supporting data is not generated by the FDA, it's generated by the device sponsor. However, the FDA, in its review, verifies that the data set, the reference standard, and the analysis methods and the reported numbers are appropriate and truthful. For this device, one of the bars that need to be passed to enter the market is that the radiologist perform better with the device in detecting fractures than without it. And that statement is at the bottom bullet point. Again, the FDA does not perform the data collection, but reviews and scrutinizes the data to confirm that the study is performed appropriately and the reported change in performance is truthful. The next two concepts, beneficence and non-maleficence, are closely linked in benefit risk analysis. Benefit risk analysis is required for PMA and de novo devices, and I did not have time to describe what FDA requires in a PMA submission or when FDA requires a de novo or 510K submission. And if there are any questions about these differences, maybe we can discuss those in the panel session. But assuming that many people are familiar with this, for PMA devices, the FDA determines whether the device provides a reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness by weighing any probable benefit to health from the use of the device against any probable risk of injury or illness from such use. And likewise, for devices granted marketing authority under de novo requests, they should be sufficiently understood to explain all the risks and benefits of the device. These de novo devices typically serve as predicates for future AI and ML-enabled devices that enter the market through the 510K paradigm. So risk-benefit analysis applies to most, if not all, AI ML-enabled devices. Here are the factors FDA considers in assessing device benefits or assessment of beneficence. These factors are type of benefits, magnitude of benefits, probability of a patient experiencing one or more benefits, and the duration of effects. And here are the factors FDA considers in assessing device risks or assessment of non-maleficence. These factors are device-related serious adverse events, device-related non-serious adverse events, procedure-related complications, probability of a harmful event, duration of harmful events, and risk from false positive and false negative results for diagnostics. The next ethics concept that I would like to discuss is justice. In Beauchamp and Childress's book, this is defined as equal distribution of burdens and benefits of new or experimental treatments among all groups in society. As a new technology, AI raises new challenges regarding bias and fairness, starting with the definitions of these concepts. For example, there are multiple definitions of fairness, some of which cannot be satisfied simultaneously. In the work referenced at the bottom here, the authors show that a device that's well calibrated with respect to group membership may still have disparate impact on members of different groups. A well-calibrated device is one where the device outputs the same likelihood of positivity for an individual, irrespective of the individual's group membership. Assuming this, the authors show that if the prevalence of disease among two groups is different, then one cannot have equal false positive and equal false positive and negative rates across those groups. Then you can have the same specificity, for example, for the two groups, but your sensitivity will be different, which will imply that the device will have different impacts for the two groups. And again, starting with the definitions, the International Organization for Standardization defines bias in statistical terms, the degree to which a reference value deviates from truth. This definition emphasizes the average difference. From a societal perspective, bias is often connected to values and viewed through the lens of differential treatment or disparate impact. However, regardless of the definitions, I believe that most would agree that care should be taken so that AI does not perpetuate or make worse already existing healthcare inequities, and also that AI has the potential to actually reduce healthcare inequities if used correctly. Regarding the distribution of burdens and benefits of new devices among all groups in society, FDA has published a number of guidances in recent years listed here. These guidance documents provide recommendations to improve the quality, consistency, and transparency of data regarding the performance of medical devices within specific sex, age, racial, and ethnic groups. We also study multiple sources of bias that can occur in AI-related devices, such as selection bias, automation bias, user interaction bias, etc., and review submissions in light of these possible biases. Transparency is a very important topic regarding bias issues and medical devices, and it was covered in much detail earlier today. What I'm going to say is just part of it. Transparency in an AI-enabled device informs the device users and patients about how the AI-enabled device was trained and tested. For example, what were the training and test data sets? What were the reference standards used for performance measurement? And ideally, transparency helps clarify device performance for relevant patient subgroups, including minority or protected subpopulations. The FDA is doing a good job here, but we can do better. One of the difficulties is the size of the data sets for meaningful subgroup analysis. For FDA clearance, the adequacy of supporting performance data depends on sponsors' claims. Sometimes small data sets may be sufficient to demonstrate claims for the general population, but not for meaningful subgroup analysis. This is one of the areas where continuing monitoring of device performance after the device enters the market is very important. And this is one of the areas where the entire ecosystem, developers, radiology departments, radiologists, and regulators need to work together to collect data and better understand the performance. In the next few minutes, I'm going to talk about some FDA initiatives. The FDA's Patient Engagement Advisory Committee is designed specifically to consist of members from patients, caregivers, and representatives of patient organizations only. It focused its 2020 meeting on artificial intelligence and machine learning. There was a special focus on bias and diversity, and the consensus was that FDA and industry should consider to assure that diverse groups of patients are reflected in training and validation data sets, and that we should not only seek to engage research communities and academia, but also must include community organizations and local providers for the populations that are intended to reach. Another recent FDA initiative is the Digital Health Center of Excellence. It was established less than a year ago to align and coordinate digital health resources across the agency. AI/ML is a very important area of focus for the Digital Health Center of Excellence. And some other areas of focus include wearables, cybersecurity, virtual and augmented reality, etc. The Digital Health Center of Excellence aims to connect and build partnerships to accelerate digital health advancements, share knowledge to advance best practices, and to innovate regulatory approaches to provide efficient and least burdensome oversight. Based on our interactions with all the stakeholders, the Digital Health Center of Excellence released an AI/ML action plan earlier this year. So we'll work to foster a patient-centered approach, starting with a workshop on transparency to users that will take place very soon, likely this fall. We'll support development of regulatory science methods related to algorithm bias and robustness. We'll work to advance real-world performance pilots in coordination with stakeholders and other programs. We'll strengthen FDA's role in harmonizing good machine learning practices through standards development and other initiatives. And we had previously published a discussion paper about modifications to AI/ML-based software as a medical device. We'll update the framework, including through guidance. So in summary, ethics considerations are at the core of FDA regulation. Data-driven nature of AI machine learning poses new challenges in areas such as data sets, bias and fairness, and transparency. And FDA has a number of initiatives to tackle new challenges in AI-enabled devices with input from stakeholders. And here are some of the FDA guidances and FDA web pages I mentioned in my talk. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Sahiner. Next up, we have Dr. Hugh Harvey. Dr. Harvey is an experienced clinician and health technology advisor with a focus on leveraging big data and artificial intelligence. He's going to be talking about emerging differences in US and EU regulations. And over to you, Dr. Harvey.
Hello, good evening. I assume you can hear and see my slides. If not, I will just carry on until someone tells me otherwise. I'm just going to talk very briefly on the different regulatory frameworks that we see in America. The FDA, as we've just heard, has got some very interesting advances in the AI workspace, and how the European regulations and indeed the new UKCA regulations might differ. I always start off by saying algorithms are the new drugs, and people who disagree with this are just wrong. Algorithms need to be heavily regulated, just like drugs. I'm very glad that several regulatory bodies around the world are taking this seriously. So you start off, with a use specification. I'm trying to highlight the differences here between the two systems. So both systems, you have to provide the regulators with an intended use statement. The format of that statement is slightly different between the FDA and in Europe. In Europe, you provide one use specification, which lists all of the contraindications, your indications, your patient population, your disease process, and the intended environment. Whereas in America, under the FDA, you provide intended use, and then you provide an intended conditions that you want to use it in. And the intended use is needs to be very carefully worded. It informs all of your labeling claims. As we saw in the previous lecture, the FDA will review your labeling claims, and it covers your advertising materials, anything you say to clients at conferences, etc. So getting your intended use is the keystone of all regulation, and the pathways are slightly different. This is how it works in the FDA, is that the intended use and the indications for use are put into separate documentation, but in essence, it's all part and parcel of the same thing. You need to be very prescriptive of exactly who you can use your device on, in which environment, the qualifications of the end user, and you need to clarify all of the potential misuses, and that feeds into a benefit risk analysis, again, has already been mentioned by previous speakers. The risk classification system is slightly different between both jurisdictions. Ostensibly, the whole world follows the International Medical Device Regulators Forum, the IMDRF. It follows their guidance on risk classification, except with the nuance that in Europe, class 2 is split into classes 2A and 2B, whereas the FDA just have class 1, 2, and 3. There's nuances in special controls and design conformity assessments that can take place between different risk classes. But in essence, in the EU, your risk class defines your route to conformity, whether you're going to do batch audits or have a single audit or do post-market. Whereas in the US, the route is actually based on the novelty of device. So you have de novo for brand new devices or PMA, and then you have 510K for devices which are essentially based on predicate devices. So the conformity route choice is not based on necessarily on class, with the caveat that if you are a class 3 device, you are automatically have to do a de novo. Sorry, if you're a de novo, you're automatically class 3 until proven otherwise in America. Both regulatory systems base themselves on common international standards, ISO standards, which are International Standard Organization, and IEC standards, the International Electrotechnical Commission. The standards all are given random 5-digit numbers, but the ones that are common to both the FDA and the EU are on the screen. In terms of quality management systems, the FDA, up until I believe 2019, had a system called 21 CFR for quality management, but now they do accept ISO 13485. So you can build a quality management system that underpins your medical device development for both geographies. I'm not going to go into too much detail on the ISO standards, just to say that they are globally recognized standards. So you won't go wrong by following them. The infrastructures are slightly different as well between America and Europe. In Europe, the European Commission sets the medical device regulations, and then each country, each of the 27 member states of Europe has their own national regulatory body. In England, we have the MHRA. The MHRA aren't like the FDA. They don't do the reviews themselves. They farm that out to notified bodies. There's several across Europe. Not all are able to look at AI or machine learning devices or software, so you have to choose your notified body carefully. And the notified bodies are the ones that audit the vendors. The European medical device regulations have recently been updated in May this year. It's 6 times longer, and they are now laws rather than directives, which are sort of what you should be doing. This is now the law. It mentions safety many more times, and it has more annexes and more examples for people to peruse. It also has a big increase in post-market clinical follow-up and surveillance, which is not too far off what the FDA are looking at in terms of their post-market activities. The main changes that I just want to briefly highlight. So if you have an MDD classification and you're upgrading to an MDR, you need to make sure, first of all, that your device is still defined as a medical device. The risk classification has likely increased. Most class 1 devices that use AI are now almost definitely class 2A or above under the MDR. And you now need mandatory post-market surveillance plan, and you need to have regular periodic safety update reports known as PSUR. These can be annual or every 2 years. You also need to have a very detailed post-market clinical follow-up plan, which was in existence before, but is now mandatory. The European guidance is now also recommending unique device identification. The FDA has been doing this for many years, but now Europe has just caught on. So this is a harmonization between the two. And Europe never had a central database like the MORDS database or the FDA database, and they are building one called UDAMED. It is consistently being delayed, and I think it's going to arrive in 2 or 3 years' time. But until then, unlike in America, you can't search for which devices have been regulatory approved. So the definitions of medical devices have slightly changed recently in Europe, in that now standalone software is classified in its own right when it wasn't previously. And now they include the specific medical purposes of prediction and prognosis, which of course is what ML models are very good at. And this comes under in Rule 11. So this is about the up classification. Essentially, if your device could have an impact that could cause death or irreversible deterioration of someone's state of health, then it could be class 3, so the highest risk category, or indeed class 2B, typically for products that are dealing in the oncology space. So there's an up classification that has happened. And again, 2A and 2B don't exist under the FDA. So what about the UK? We're sort of in this confused post-Brexit state where we still accept the old MDD and the new MDR, and we're developing our own UKCA process. We used to have the UKCA before we joined Europe back in the 60s, disappeared in the 70s when we joined Europe, and now it's back again, but we don't know what it's going to look like because AI wasn't invented or wasn't popular back then. The UK regulatory infrastructure is very much like the European, except there are only 3 approved bodies and that you can currently go to get a UKCA mark. We are still deciding what we're going to do in England. One possible future route is something new that neither the FDA or the European Union do, which is to have what's known as a provisional license and then a learner plate license. So once you get your quality management system checked, you might get a provisional license to do pilot studies and stuff with your device. Once you've done all of your lifecycle processes and been through your audit, you might get a learner license, so that'll be your initial approval. And then once you've done a couple of years of post-market, then you get your full approval. So that might be a future track for AI devices. If we look at the phases of clinical studies, where would that come in? Well, you might get your provisional license after testing it in pseudo-clinical real-world conditions, but then you get your full license only after you've done all your post-market surveillance. So you've been in a learner phase for a couple of years. And that, I think this is a quite nice change from current regulations, and it does distinguish UK from the rest of the world. The US regulatory infrastructure is much more simple than in Europe and the UK. You just have the FDA who deal directly with all the vendors. The FDA do farm out a bit of outsourcing, but it still comes all under the remit of FDA. The definition of medical device software is only slightly different in nuance. They refer to machine rather than software in their guidance. but they do include, obviously, a statement about intending for use and diagnosing of disease or other conditions. So essentially, it's the same. You might see the phrase MDSW in some places and SAMD in others. Software as a medical device is the correct technical term for AI-driven software. MDSW is kind of medical device software that might drive a hardware. It's like the software inside an ECG machine or something. So FDA pathways. I'm not going to go into huge detail other than to say I'm very impressed with what the FDA are proposing in terms of good machine learning practice. Once your model is developed, they are going to hopefully produce some quite robust guidance on how to formally test, train, validate, deploy, and then monitor in a post-market fashion. I think European regulations are slightly ahead in terms of post-market follow-up, though they're not AI specific. It's the same post-market regulations for any device. But I do like this GMLP, Good Machine Learning Practice Framework, that is in discussion currently. As said before, the FDA has different pathways to market. In Europe and in the UK, we just have CE marking. There aren't these different pathways. Every device does the same. But in America, you have these 4 potential pathways. The 3 main ones are 510K for predicates, de novo for low to moderate risk but new devices, and pre-market for very high risk devices, which might typically be class 3. The good machine learning practice framework, as I mentioned before, is still under discussion and debate. I'm probably not the best expert speaker on where the FDA are at with this, and maybe we can discuss in the panel later. But Europe is watching and taking this into consideration as well. What the FDA have already said is that they appreciate that algorithms change over time, and therefore there needs to be a set rule or set of parameters by which you might decide to change what's known as the intended use, and hence have to do a reclassification or a new submission. So this might be if you're changing what you're measuring in a new physical parameter. It might be if you're changing your target population, i.e. from women to men or to children or something, or obviously changing anatomical location. Or if you're changing your intended use environment of that measurement or system. So if you're going from screening system to a diagnostic system, that you may need to reclassify and resubmit. And the last is having a new effect actually on the clinical outcome. So if you're making new claims on effect on clinical outcome, you may need to have a repeat submission through the FDA. And you can change your algorithm through a predetermined change control plan, a PCCP. And you can change the algorithm specifically itself through an ACP, an algorithmic change protocol. So that would, you basically pre-agree with the regulators what are your verification validation steps to follow when you're going to be changing anything in the background of the algorithm, such as new data being ingested, retraining the algorithm, and repeated updating of your performance evaluation. So what are the similarities between the FDA and the European and the UKCA? Well, really actually global regulations for software as a medical device are actually harmonizing, not diverging, which is good for vendors. What you don't want to have to do is do a completely separate submission in America than to Europe. At the moment, there is a lot of overlap. I would say it's 80% overlap, but there's still about 20% of work you have to kind of do from scratch, depending which one you want to go for first. The intended use is pretty much the same. So you can use the same intended use for both the FDA and CE marking, which is good, though it might put you in different risk classes, depending on which geography you're in. So you need to watch out for that. Both FDA and EU follow the international standards and the IEC standards, so you can't go wrong by using those, and you can get audited separately for each of those. And now all devices need, all devices above class 2 need a QMS, which you can get to ISO 13485. The FDA used to mandate its own version of quality systems with 21 CFR. You still can do 21 CFR, but you're better served by doing an ISO version because the FDA will accept that now as well. And all devices, wherever you are in the world, need a clinical evaluation, which includes a literature review, and something I see sometimes, unfortunately, AI companies forgetting to put into their reports. And of course, post-market follow-up is the new kid on the block, especially for AI. Of course, there are differences, and I've highlighted some of these. The organizational framework between the FDA and the EU is different. So the FDA is a single body, where in Europe we have lots of notified bodies and governmental institutions, and the FDA has different pathways, predicate, de novo, etc., whereas in the EU we just have CE marking. As far as I know, only the FDA is looking at GMLP, and algorithmic updates. That said, there are a couple of ISO standards on artificial intelligence soon to be released, which may include these, which Europe may harmonize into their MDR. The risk classification is slightly different, as I said. The conformity route is slightly different between geographies, but it's nothing insurmountable. And in essence, in general, a diagnostic AI system is usually the same class and can undergo the same conformity routes in both geographies. There can be nuances. I would say that the EU PMCF, the post-market clinical follow-up, is probably more robust under MDR currently than FDA processes, but as we've seen before, the FDA are obviously thinking hard about this, and it's starting to become mandatory and more robust. And then the last difference is there is no central database of approved devices in the European Union yet. So that will be coming. The new ISO standards to watch out for are the ones based on AI, specifically 24029, the assessment of the robustness of neural networks. This may well be included into the MDR under some new revisions. So it's one to watch out. If you have access to ISO standards, I recommend having a peruse of that one. And that is the end of my very brief whistle-stop tour of the differences between America and Europe. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Harvey. Next up is Professor Tschider. Professor Tschider is an assistant professor at the Loyola University Chicago School of Law and a member of the Beasley Institute for Health Law and Policy. Professor Tschider will be giving us a brief update on the legal landscape in AI in radiology, presumably more focused here in the US, but maybe not so much. So over to you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. And, of course, I'm sort of bookending this presentation because I'm focused more primarily on privacy and responsible AI. And I do want to leave enough time for questions. So certainly I will only be scratching the surface. But thank you so much for having me. And I'll just jump in. So as you've been hearing about pretty much all of today, of course, healthcare imaging exhibits kind of two categories of AI, and I actually study both of them in a lot of my other research. So today I might be talking about privacy, but I am very concerned and interested in the intersection between FDA regulation under the NDA in the EU, and privacy as it is explored globally. So today it's more focused on the US perspective, but certainly I'm interested in a little broader conversation, hopefully in the question and answer period. With diagnostic medicine and AI-enabled Internet of Health things, we know that data is essential. And this is something that I've been really kind of pushing back against in the privacy community, where data minimization is a key focus. To have responsible AI, to have AI that is appropriate for different communities, that is representative of some differences in those communities, AI that are safe and efficacious, data are necessary. I know I'm speaking to the choir here when I say that, but it's important to know that the privacy laws, as we think about them historically, are really not set up for this. And so I'll be talking through a little bit of kind of why I think privacy law today is kind of an older standard, and certainly is something that we can think about progressively going forward to really achieve data essentialism and to balance the interests between data minimization and data maximization. So historical privacy frameworks focus on really kind of four key areas. And this is true whether you look at the United States or you look at the rest of the world, including the European Union. First, we have notice and consent. In the EU, we call that lawful basis. At least in part, there are a lot of bases for why we can use data, why we can collect it, why we can use it, why we can retain it, whether we can transfer it. We also have data minimization, which applies to not just the collection or the use, but also retention, duplication, and sharing. We have data subject rights related to access, correction, restriction, deletion. So what can an individual do with respect to the data we've collected about them? And then finally, identifiability, which is not often described as sort of a separate tenet of privacy law, but is really essential to our definition of personal information at all, or protected health information at all. Now, what's important, I think, about these privacy areas or these kind of topics within privacy law is that they're generally managed separately from safety and efficacy. Now, that looks a little different when we look across the world, but in the United States, although we may have a requirement, for example, in the Code of Federal Regulations related to privacy in medical devices, we often don't see the FDA getting really involved in privacy considerations. And so it's interesting to see the interplay between the FDA and other parts of the Department of Health and Human Services, and sort of what I'm going to say are coextensive obligations to enforce laws of HIPAA as well as the FDCA, and its updates over time. And what's really interesting is to see how those organizations work together. And I would argue that there probably is more coordination and more work that could be done in that space. Privacy also is often not built into technology from the very beginning. So I really appreciated the keynote speaker's discussion here about really getting ahead of the problem. So involving consultation early means that individuals start to think about these challenges from the very beginning. Privacy is one of those areas where often it's thought about after an application, an AI application or AI product is developed. It's something that in large part can be highly procedural, and from a legal perspective involves a lot of paperwork without a lot of activity or design considerations that think about it. And then finally, there is sort of a fragmented application. So most of us in the legal area who study privacy know that we have a patchwork quilt of privacy in the United States. And that means that HIPAA, for example, will apply to some organizations, but not to others. And the Federal Trade Commission is really relegated to pick up kind of the extra pieces, which may or may not be effective, if we think about it within a HIPAA construct. So identifiability, one of the key areas. Well, we know that identifiability is going to come into question because we have big data sets that could nevertheless be considered identifiable, and they're necessary for AI implementations. Those big data could be collected across geographies and likely will be collected across geographies that have attendant privacy considerations with them. We have localization requirements. We have a variety of other, let's say, data impediments that make it harder to collect data in one place and to analyze data in one place. And furthermore, we know that data cannot always be de-identified or cannot always be anonymized. And that causes a lot of issues when we're thinking about extended and extensible types of uses for data or reuse in areas, especially outside of the clinical space, where presumably we have a little bit more flexibility. AI can be used to identify and create inferences. So I think as speakers have talked about earlier today, sometimes when you have a very large data set, it may be identifiable even though you have taken all of the right process-based steps to remove identifying characteristics. And then finally, many of you may be aware of HIPAA's current de-identification safe harbor. Safe harbor permits organizations to remove 18 identifiers to determine that a data set is de-identified. And there are some exceptions to that. Certainly you can go the route of thinking about a third party and a third party statistically evaluating your data set to determine that it has been de-identified in that way. But most organizations are following sort of the safe harbor path where they remove certain identifiers. The challenge, of course, from a privacy perspective is if you have enough data, you probably are still able to identify an individual anyway. And so the question is whether that, from a risk perspective, actually is sufficient in the goals we're trying to think about from a privacy perspective. Data minimization as well is a challenge. So I use the terminology of data essentialism because I believe that there's a balance to be struck between maximization and minimization. But historically, privacy laws, especially privacy laws that apply to sensitive data, like health data, really promote data minimization. The data minimization really pushes back against goals for safety and efficacy. And again, having appropriate data from a variety of populations, and sometimes that can be difficult to collect, on your own. And so the concept of data reuse is really important as we think about data minimization as well. And on the privacy side, we often don't think about the ways in which we may be introducing more risk to an individual. Maybe we are justified in collecting data and using it, but we may not actually be justified in retaining it indefinitely or retaining it for long periods of time, after which point maybe data are no longer as useful as they once were. So there's a lot of complexity here around data minimization, but we know that data use continues indefinitely, and most of the time data do not lose value. So we have to think about new and better ways to promote innovation and new and better ways to use data that may be in the interest of downstream users, but doesn't sort of harness innovation and connect it to some of the challenges in privacy law that are really built for kind of an old world of data use. I've written a lot on the concept of notice and consent and how this is a challenging space, in particular in the health area. But some of the problems that we know are sort of attached to this procedural concept of notice and consent is related to whether or not individual autonomy is really promoted by this kind of a model. Especially in the United States, we have focused on notice as transparency, and consent as choice. And unfortunately, when we think about some of the problems attached to, a physical document, a written document, or a document that's presented on a mobile device, for example, are number one, can somebody even negotiate it? And we call that a voluntariness problem, that contracts of adhesion and course of care, so signing off on something in the context of really needing healthcare, is probably not going to promote individual autonomy in a lot of important ways. Secondly, there's a structural problem. So there was a study done that estimated the amount of days that somebody would actually take to read every privacy notice that was displayed to them is 76 24-hour days. So I'm a privacy expert. I spend a lot of my time thinking about privacy, and I don't even spend 76 days a year reading privacy notices. So expecting the average person to do so is really not a fair expectation. Additionally, the cognition problem. So privacy is a form of risk. A lack of privacy is a type of risk that's really distinct from informed consent, which despite its problems is usually able to communicate what the risks are in a fairly salient way. So in a way that the person can understand. Privacy risk is really distinct and different in that it's very hard to describe what the chances are of unauthorized use, what the chances are of some real injury after data are misused in some way, whether they're stolen or whether they're disclosed to an employer or something similar. And so it's very, very hard for that to help somebody make a real choice about their data. I also talk about an exogeneity problem and an abstraction problem. So we know that anytime we're implementing an AI technology, there are often a lot of back-end systems. And especially when you think about a commercialized version of the technology, you often have a university that maybe started the process, an entity that was formed that was more like a startup. Perhaps that technology was then sold to a larger medical device manufacturer. And perhaps from a technical perspective, you have a variety of third parties behind the scenes that are offering the infrastructure and other technological components that form the actual invention and technology. It's really difficult to communicate to an individual, a downstream user, what the potential risks could be, whether that's from a security perspective, from a fairness perspective, et cetera. And so relying on a notice to do that is challenging. And then finally, this is definitely unique with respect to AI, is the temporal problem. So usually when we think about notice and consent, it's this idea that we notify about what the data uses are and what we're going to do with the data, how we're protecting the data, and then you consent to it and then we're good. Well, the problem with AI and let's just say big data research in general is that data are highly useful and we may not always know what role those data will play in the algorithm, how important they might be, how important they might not be. And so it's very, very difficult to disclose on the outset and really promote real choice in this space. So a lot of kind of key problems in the privacy space. So just kind of taking a little turn. So how might we think about notice and consent long term? And how do we think about creating the right kind of privacy scaffolding? Well, first of all, reconceptualizing as data essentialism, I think, is tremendously useful. Balancing data minimization and data maximization in ways that are going to actually benefit the individual. Considering more formal legal data philanthropy models. So individuals can actually donate their data in a way that does not come with attendant constraints. Planning for strategic de-identification, pseudonymization, and anonymization practices that really are in the best interest of the individual and apply, let's say, more expertise in technological models. Signaling AI use where needed, and positioning AI use and data collection as healthcare operations as much as possible. So one of the challenges for a lot of organizations is they depict AI use and data collection as sort of a secondary step, when in reality, it may be very central to the healthcare experience and very central to a patient's experience. And then finally, I've encouraged the US to think a little bit more about the concept of legitimate interest, which is a concept that's under the General Data Protection Regulation in the EU, but is sort of an extension of lawful basis. So we have privacy notice and consent, which is typically what's used in the US. Perhaps we should be calculating what's in the best interest of individuals downstream, rather than thinking about notice and consent as the primary means of doing that. And then just as I'm wrapping up, I have an example of how we might weigh the different interests between organizations and individuals. And certainly there are a lot of different procedural methods for conducting these analyses on the outset, or conducting these analyses when something changes. So when it goes from the process of clinical research into a commercialized product might be another time to do this type of analysis. So thank you all for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Professor Tschider. So I am going to jump in here and abuse my privileges as moderator to start off by asking a few questions of my own. Throughout these really wonderful presentations, there have also been some questions that have come in from the audience, and we will ask, we'll get to those as well. So let me just, on the subject of regulations, and also because as a lawyer, I'm biased to be thinking about those. I want to circle back to both something you said, Professor Tschider, and also something you touched upon, Dr. Harvey, in both of your presentations, which is basically, I think both of you gave very different perspectives on the existing regulatory framework. And Professor Tschider, at the end, you gave some recommendations about how to make these privacy laws better. But what I would like to ask you both and give you both a chance to weigh in on, and then perhaps we can go Dr. Harvey first, then Professor Tschider, so you can take a breath after your presentation, and then if any of the other panelists want to jump in, that would be fine. But I think my major question is not simply how do we make these regulations better, not simply what are the gaps in the regulations, but also how do we make these regulations practical? There's something that I worry about all the time, which is that there is a certain cost to enacting regulations that goes to lawyers and folks like myself, which is important, don't get me wrong, but also I think we need to be very careful and cautious and conscientious about exactly what it is we're incentivizing. Not every organization has, unlimited resources. And so I would love it if just kind of both of you, starting with Dr. Harvey, weighed in a little bit about the practicality of these regulations as they're evolving, as you think they should improve related to AI.
That's a really good question. And I deal with startups a lot, and they're all shocked and honestly disappointed when I tell them it's going to take them a year to get their FDA approval and they have to do a clinical study. And then they'll talk to someone like Charlotte who says, well, is your data privacy up to scratch? I don't deal with that. We don't deal with GDPR, but it's a hugely complex area. So how to make it practical? I guess I'd flip the question and say, what's the minimum amount of regulation that you need to ensure that this stuff is safe, that patients are being served adequately, that data protection is being put in place appropriately? And that is a very hard question to answer because we are in the Wild West of AI and medical devices. There's been a few early diggers to the gold mines, but really we're still kind of catching up in all fronts on the regulation. For me, one of the largest problems with regulation is, as my talk kind of alluded to, the disparity in the global approach. Imagine being a startup and then trying to sell your medical device around the world, and then finding out you have to repeat processes for different countries. It's very, very disheartening. But that's just the nature of the diaspora that we live in globally. But I'll hand over to Charlotte if she has any other insights I want to add.
Yeah, I mean, I have the opportunity to work with a lot of startups too, as well. And the way that I usually conceptualize it for them is, would you like to do more of the work now, or do you want to do more of the work later? So sometimes the upfront planning can result in long-term less work. It's the same kind of approach that we talk about with cybersecurity, right? You can invest in the security solutions now, or you can pay 3 times the amount remediating it later. And so the calculation in terms of time, effort, and money, usually is better served to do it initially. So if I was thinking of ways to sort of make regulation more palatable, I would think of activities an organization could take that would sort of check multiple boxes at the same time. So for example, if you're working with an IRB and you're doing a lot of activities related to considering the interests of individuals, whether it's an IRB or a secondary body, that you could do a lot of this work kind of initially and then revise it along the way. Now that would mean that we would have to accept some of those documents as indicative of, for example, privacy policies or privacy activities that you've implemented for your organization. And that can be a little difficult because you might have, depending on how the FDA or other organizations around the world have evaluated you, you may still have to do more to prove that you're doing enough as your organization changes from something that's more clinical to something more commercialized, or something that is extended to more audiences, offered to more individuals in more countries. There's sort of a cost every single time that you're making that kind of a change, a transactional cost that is somewhat unavoidable. But if there's more you can do upfront, that's going to kind of count for legal requirements later, I think that would be beneficial.
Got it. Okay, well, thank you so much. Before I have a question inspired by something you said, Dr. Magnus, but if either of you, Dr. Magnus or Dr. Sahiner, want to jump in on that question, I'll pause for a second if you'd like to talk about the practicality of compliance and regulation.
My biggest worry is that too much of the compliance issues focus on things that don't really matter. I mean, some of them do, and I definitely think patient safety is important. I don't want to discount that, but I thought Dr. Scheiner's point that, for example, about informed consent and the myth of it, and the things that the hoops that we have people jump through that don't really do very much. And thinking through why we have that as a requirement, and maybe there are better ways of doing it so that we don't have obstacles that slow things down but don't actually achieve the goals for which they're there. So I think on the one hand it's thinking about that, but then the other side of it, which I already alluded to, is that I worry especially for AI, a lot of the things that really matter are completely ignored by the regulatory system. So, if you have a device for identifying, so people are doing research on evaluating faces to see whether they can make clinical predictions from different kinds of digital phenotyping, or people are doing other kinds of research to identify stress in individuals from different kinds of signals. The focus is on the protection of the individuals, maybe at best making sure that if it's going to be medically used in clinical practice, that it does what it's supposed to do and doesn't harm people. But if it turns out that this same technology makes it possible to radically transform the workplace and take away workers' rights, or can be used in China to identify dissidents when they're protesting, none of that is relevant to the regulatory system, even if they're entirely predictable. And so that's my biggest worry, is that our current system isn't set up. And I also will add, I don't think it's not that the solution to that is to have the regulatory system address those issues, that the IRBs should be taking those broader things into account. I do think it's really important to separate compliance issues and regulatory issues from ethical issues that are broader and are downstream. I don't want the IRB to do that. The compliance functions need to do what they need to do, but it's just really important to recognize that they're very limited and that the real ethical challenges of research go far beyond those. And it isn't, the solution to that is not to make those other things do what they're ill prepared to, and probably would be not, the juice would not be worth the squeeze to have FDA regulate those things or have IRBs regulate those things, but instead to have alternative means of changing the culture so that researchers take those things into account and mitigate those risks in an active, ongoing way.
I just wanted to give an example, and this is not exactly about patient privacy or protection, but an example where I think we're trying to make it easier for machine learning algorithms to become really machine learning. And I do believe that it will help companies comply better because they may have more opportunities to evolve their algorithms as they gather more data or as the clinical conditions are changing. And that's a discussion paper we published 2 years ago about changes to AI ML devices. And the idea is that because, to really call it machine learning, the learning implies that the system is learning something, but currently, most of the devices that are submitted to the FDA are frozen, and the companies especially before that publication, they were supposed to come to the FDA whenever they make a change that might affect the performance of their device. But I think this makes it very hard to comply in some situations, because let's say that you discovered something changing in the disease condition, the prevalence changed or something, and you want to adjust the threshold. And then you would have to come to the FDA, which makes it really difficult for the company to both keep learning and comply with the FDA regulations. So that paper, and it's no secret that we're working on a guidance now about that, is really intended to make it easier for companies to adapt their algorithms based on new data, within a very well-defined boundaries and within their indications for use. So I think that's one example where you can take a novel regulatory approach, maybe to also not only help the field develop, but also help the companies comply better.
Well, that's great, and I used to be a journalist, and I would be missing an opportunity if I didn't ask you, Dr. Sahiner, if mentioning that paper you're working on, if we could get any more details about where it is in the pipeline and when we might be able to expect to learn more, because that's, I think, certainly a really exciting development.
So that paper was out 2 years ago. It is just a proposed framework, but the idea is that we are developing a guidance based on that. But as you know, guidances take time to develop. And of course, the initial version is going to be a draft guidance to gather feedback from stakeholders and move from there. So I can't give you a timetable, okay, but it's in the works.
All right. Well, I asked. We tried. So, two questions for you, Dr. Magnus, and then we'll take some questions from the audience. So I think so I'll ask both, and then you can opine on either. So the last point you made, talking about the difference between compliance and ethics, I was struck by that in your initial presentation, mainly because something that I see all the time is that it's very clear whose job it is to enforce compliance, typically lawyers or compliance personnel. As soon as the word ethics gets involved, which I would actually love for you to provide us a definition of what you think of when you think of ethics. it can be a lot murkier. It's a shared responsibility, and it can just be difficult to implement in practice. So I would love if you could talk a little bit about how you think ethics, as opposed to compliance, if we're really going to make that distinction, can be upheld in the real world of deployments. And on that note, one of the things that struck me about your presentation, which I thoroughly enjoyed, is how focused it was on research and research subjects. And so I wonder if you might be willing to give some thoughts about kind of how what you have learned in the research realm might be translated into the world of deployed tools in patients and productization and kind of care settings. So 2 questions for you. Yeah.
Sure. So for the first, I'd say that it's sometimes clear for compliance who's responsible, but I don't know. One of my roles as an associate dean is dealing with the ambiguity. We spent a lot of times with the head of the IRB and folks at our Office of General Counsel and people in HR and I kind of going around and around about who's responsible for ensuring some particular non-compliance that's arisen and who's responsible for investigating it and so on. So I think even the compliance piece, it's not always that straightforward for figuring out who ultimately is really the individual or what office is responsible. So I think even that can be somewhat amorphous. And the patchwork of regulations make that even more complicated, right? So non-compliance that's got NIH funding or is it for something that's FDA regulated requires certain kinds of notifications that if those are not present are not required, and that makes a huge difference even if the non-compliance is substantially similar. So I think even that side of things can be somewhat amorphous. On the ethics side of it, though, I mean, I've already given some ideas of how we might start that process. Things like the ESR or ethics consultation services are ways of trying to start to meet the ethical need. But ultimately, it's unfortunate that in the revision to the Common Rule that happened a few years ago, the SACARP, the Secretary's Advisory Committee on Human Research Protection, had recommended one change to the Common Rule that did not take place, which was that the integrity of the investigator being the most important protection, or one of the most important protection, should have been included in the regulations formally. And it is unfortunate that those were not included in the regulations. So ultimately, ethics is going to be successful. It's really going to be about the individual investigators doing the right thing. As an IRB member at Stanford and our approach to IRB, it's not my job when I'm wearing my IRB hat to make sure that all the research that's done is done ethically. And one worry about such a reliance on the protectionist system that we've developed and evolved over time is that to some extent, I worry researchers have outsourced ethical thinking to the IRBs and to other kinds of bodies. And that's what we absolutely do not want. And so we're very clear on the IRB that there may be things that, yeah, there's universal consensus, this would be a bad idea, but it doesn't, it doesn't violate any of the regulations, doesn't violate any of the shadow regulations. So they're really stupid if they do this. And if it's in the New York Times, they'll be ruined, but that's not our job. That's their job to make sure that their work is ethically conducted. And I think not enough researchers really are aware of those limitations of the regulatory system, and that therefore they do have substantive obligations, and that we need to find ways of giving the people the tools to make sure they're informed about those things. I don't necessarily expect every investigator to spend their time reading the American Journal of Bioethics or IRB or Hastings Center report. And so there need to be tools available so that they can learn things that they don't currently know. But again, we're trying to build scaffolding that makes it easier for people to be able to think in those kinds of ways. Your second issue, remind me again what your second question was.
Research related to the implementation.
Shifting to implementation in clinical practice. I have a lot to say about that, actually, partly related to things that I'm currently working on in that space as well. I'm very worried about what happens. I think it's really important that we study what really happens in real systems, the systems level, what happens when things are actually implemented clinically. I think that's going to be a very fruitful and important area of research and of QI and both. And so I think that's going to be important as we look at things. But I would also say there's a way in which AI is the camel's nose in the tent of something that's been happening for a long time in healthcare, but that has been widely unrecognized by patients and surprisingly little appreciated by clinicians, which is when you look at the fundamental ethos of medicine and medical ethics, it's really built on a foundation of a dyadic relationship between a patient and a physician. So not in the research realm, but in the clinical realm. It really comes out of, and all of our thinking about ethics, informed consent, confidentiality, all of these things come out of the notion of a dyadic relationship between a patient and a physician. And the reality is that that has not been how clinical care has been provided in a long time, and that patients are largely ignorant of the many factors that actually curtail clinician autonomy or liberty to do things, whether those are formularies or best practices and pathways and all kinds of things that actually often take away clinician, for good reason and for improved outcomes, take away clinician autonomy, and patients are completely ignorant of any of those things. So I think we really need to rethink through the ethos of medicine to recognize, and I think AI is an opportunity in the beginning of that process where people are saying, because Glenn Cohen's talk that he gave yesterday, he talked about how at one level, we don't necessarily require disclosure to patients of all the things that give rise to the reasoning that led the physician to make the particular recommendation that they made about either diagnostics or prophylaxis or treatment. They don't say, oh, it's because of a book I read, or there was this new article that informed. They don't do that. So why should it matter if it's an AI that informed them rather than the latest article that told them something about what to do? But I think there's enough concern about this as AI as an actor in these circumstances and about what it means for liability, and enough concern in this space that I'm hoping that it starts to get people to recognize the reality that patients are not actually engaged in an interaction with a individual physician in a dyadic relationship. They're engaged in a relationship with a health system and a whole group of individuals and a whole group of things. And it's really a relationship between a population and a health system. And that really means we need a different way of thinking about ethics and a new ethos that really hasn't completely evolved completely. I think the learning health system is a piece of that. David Larson's talk earlier today talked a bit about that, and I think there's a lot more work that's been done on that since that earlier work that Nancy Cass and Ruth Faden and colleagues did. But I think that's a piece of it. But really, we need a whole new framework for thinking about things that we currently don't have and move beyond where we are in the clinical space. And I'm hoping actually that AI really opens up people to recognize that the current dyadic model is inadequate for capturing the reality of clinical care.
I have to say, so I love that point. Actually, Professor Tschider, it looks like you want to jump in. Please don't let me stop you.
Well, that's all right. I agree very, very much with Dr. Magnus. I think that we're in a situation where historically we've thought about physician-patient trust as sort of the name of the game. But increasingly, although we have some AI applications now where there's a patient in the middle or a physician in the middle that's kind of validating, in the future, we may not have that. Think about artificial intelligence engaged implantable devices where they really are designed to work without a physician involved at all. So what does that mean for how we think about relationships of trust in general? And what does that mean for kind of a manufacturer-patient type of a relationship where the physician isn't involved at all? So I think it's a really interesting topic.
And we don't have to look into the future. Pathways combined with formulary limitations means that there are many cases where clinicians have absolutely no discretion about what treatment option they're going to do. There's a lot of protocolized care. If you're a prematurely born infant in the US, the amount of oxygen saturation target levels that are going to be targeted for your infant is a decision that the team made, and it's built into the devices they use about what their saturation targets level. And there may be variation across institutions about what that is, but it's protocolized at each institution, and there's very little room for clinical judgment.
Yeah, I would just say one of the reasons why I find it constantly fun to be talking about the impact of AI in whatever field it is because kind of the implication is that we need to rethink fundamental conceptions. What's a medical device? What's an intervention? What does it mean to have a doctor-patient relationship? all of these very fundamental things that I would actually venture should probably be reconsidered without AI. But I think it's a fascinating point that I haven't heard the camel's head in the tent. But I think you're spot on. So that would be really fun to come back to if we have some pauses. But there's been a lot of questions, and I'm going to see if I can get through them. Let's see, just starting. Let's start with the first question from Daniel Yang, and this was addressed to Dr. Sahiner. And the question is, based on Dr. London's presentation, does the FDA require prospective validation studies for software as a medical device to be approved for marketing?
No, I think there is no such blanket requirement. It certainly depends on the risk of the device. But for most of the devices that are currently submitted to the FDA, typically a retrospective study can fulfill the data requirements to show safety and effectiveness. But that being said, I think I want to come back to a point that was raised just a moment earlier about maybe there not being a MD or a clinician between the device and the patient. So we call part of such devices that autonomous AI, where maybe there's a treatment decision or a decision, let's say, not to call the patient back for a mammogram, for example, because it looks very normal to the AI. There's a decision being made without a clinician first seeing the image. So we call those autonomous devices. And for those, I think we haven't, as the FDA, we haven't, to my knowledge, approved any such radiological AI devices so far, but it doesn't prevent someone from, submitting one to the FDA. And for such devices, I think having prospective data collection could be very important.
All right, well, thank you very much. And I think we have another question from someone named Lee. And I believe this is also addressed to you. So we'll do a back-to-back one for you, Dr. Sahiner. How likely will an AI algorithm get breakthrough device status with the FDA, and has it been done before?
So a breakthrough device status is really a status to expedite the review of a device at the FDA, because the device, again, the name implies, may represent breakthrough work in prevention of disease or detection of disease, etc. And yes, previously AI devices have been given breakthrough status, which means that their review, in terms of the review, the thoroughness of the review, there isn't any change, but in terms of the timeline is expedited. So one, I think, well-known example is a company called Viz.ai that had a algorithm for triage of CT angiography images of the brain. So that device actually was the very first such device for triage, meaning that they really don't point to a location in the image, or they don't provide a likelihood of malignancy or a location, but just notifies a specialist saying that there might be something here. So why don't you prioritize this image in your image review, in your work list? So it was the first of such devices, and it was a de novo device that was then used as a predicate for other 510K devices. So that device did get breakthrough status and designation. And there are also other devices too. But just being AI, I think just that fact does not justify being a breakthrough device. So there is a guidance about that, and I can put it in the chat or put it, I don't know if I can put in the chat, but I can make it available that you can read about what the conditions for a breakthrough device designation is, but it's certainly possible.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Yeah, we have chat is not disabled for this, but I'm sure we can find some way to make that link available. So we have a question from Tommy Wang. This is addressed to Dr. Magnus and Professor Tschider. And the question seems like there's a twofer here. The first is, what frameworks can we use to think about which ethical and privacy challenges are best managed through regulation, external or self-enforced, versus through cultural norms and standards? Dr. Magnus, I think you talked a little bit about this already. And then the second question here from Tommy is, what entities can convene stakeholders? Dr. Magnus, do you want to kick things off?
I'm going to let Dr. Tschider go first.
Oh, I think you might be muted.
Yes. So, I think that anything organizations can do to sort of informally address these requirements before they are legal requirements is always in the best interest of the organization. And so if you are in a commercialized state, productized, you have an organization that stood up to actually sell the product and have it out in the world, perhaps you should have an advisory board of some sort internally that reports to the board. Especially if you are an organization that's in the business of medical device, you should have, for example, an AI fairness board or an AI accountability board or an AI safety board, something that connects this area of development with your overall kind of board's goals and what's important to you. And I think that, having a reporting relationship is really healthy. Certainly, there are a lot of areas of the business that do this already. Audit is an example of it. Usually as part of your, safety requirements, there is, some reporting relationship there that extends out of the quality management system and its oversight. So I can see something like that existing in this space that is sort of apart from what the legal requirements might be, which may not actually be sufficient. And that's sort of my argument is today, the law is sort of misaligned with the development of this technology and in some ways is insufficient and really not making the kind of difference that we would want it to. So perhaps, creating something internally can create a cultural norm within an organization that's going to look really positive to an external evaluator or enforcement agency like the FDA. So I think there's a lot that can be done internally. Dr. Magnus, what do you think?
Yeah, I just wanted to, in relation to the last question about who can convene and relating to sort of the issue about motivation for doing these things. Obviously, in the ideal world, we want this to be the true expression of autonomy, that is self-legislation. We want people to be legislating themselves to do the right thing. You mentioned earlier this notion that we equate informed consent with choice. For the people who actually developed the concept of autonomy in the first place, choice is incompatible with autonomy because you'd be self-legislated by right reason to only recognize one option. So anyway, so that's something I always come back to. But the motivation for doing things is really challenging, and I actually think it matters for what we can demand. And I'm thinking about that. I feel like I play a lot of different roles and wear a lot of different hats at different levels. When people are applying for funding from an entity, the entity can create standards and requirements in order to give funding. So I work for HAI, we can say, okay, you have to jump through these hoops and think about these things, and we're going to put those in place to be able to get the money. When people applied for funding for stem cell research from the California Institute for Regenerative Medicine, they could put restrictions and requirements in place because they're giving the money. When I'm on the California Stem Cell Human Research Advisory Committee, though, we're putting in regulations where we're not giving funding, and we're just saying everybody has to jump through these hoops, even though we're not giving you any money. If you're going to do this kind of research, you have to do it. And I think it's appropriate sometimes to recognize that the lines and what's required and what things you have to do might differ depending on whether or not you've got essentially skin in the game in terms of funding or not. Anyway, so I think the answer is that who can convene and what kind of authority they have to motivate these sorts of things really varies depending partly on what, who's paying for things, where's the funding coming from, what are the stakes, and all those things matter, and that you might think that the bar differs depending on the answers to those questions.
Yeah, I'll just add that I've seen a lot of success to that point, where healthcare providers who are answering directly to patients are really pulling along medical device manufacturers. And they're sort of doing it through contract, right? We're not able to contract with you unless you can exhibit these, 6 things. Now, are those 6 things the right 6 things? I don't know. But certainly anytime there is skin in the game and there's something to lose, there's a lot of motivation.
Well, thank you for that, for both of those points. I think we answered the question. I would like to attempt to combine. We actually have a host of questions here, and I'm going to see if I can combine 2 of them, and then we can just pass it around for the whole panel. So there's a question from Phil about increased validation requirements for AI, and how these requirements affect algorithms that have that just frankly use an inordinate amount of data. I'm putting words in Phil's mouth here. And then we also have a question from Eric, whose last name I will not pronounce because I'm sure I won't pronounce it correctly. But the question from Eric is about how federated learning might change approval from the FDA or a CE mark, and whether or not it's necessary to make the data accessible to obtain this type of approval or certification. And so I think it would be interesting and would help address these questions if, as a group, we could each kind of go around and answer the following question, which is, how does the volume of data used for AI, how does that, just the volume, the pure volume, how does that change what it means for regulators to approve or validate or monitor these types of models? So I will leave it open, and whoever would like to answer that should feel free.
I'll start, that's okay. I mean, as far as the FDA and the CE marking process go, the regulations are quite broad. They don't specify data volume that you need for any specific clinical use case. All the regulations say is that you should do the most appropriate study for this. The FDA can offer advice, and you can have discussions with them about what that study might look like, but it would be impossible for any regulator to pre-prescribe what data volume to look at. In essence, in my experience, the more data that you can show that you've used to validate on, the regulators will be happy with. But there's no set number. And I hope Dr. Sahiner will agree with that as well.
Yes, I do agree. And I think here we have to separate the training or design data and the test data. And I think the question that you mentioned, Andrew, about federated learning, it was about, I believe, training data. So because, the federated learning is really about how you train a system. And then once it's trained, whether it's federated or not, does not really affect how it is validated. And in that situation, I think for federated learning, we do, in any case, whether it's federated or not, ask for how the algorithm or the machine learning method was trained, what type of data sets, without going into a lot of detail about, individually listing 10,000 cases and some maybe attributes of those cases. So I think in a federated learning environment that can still be done, because the institutions where that federated learning is being done can still give information about aggregate data, what is the racial distribution, or what is the body mass index distribution in their data set, without really going into patient privacy issues. So in that sense, I think they can be handled. And again, I agree with Dr. Harvey that from a regulatory point of view, and it may not be the same from a scientific point of view, but because again, I'm talking about from a regulatory point of view, meaning that what a company claims that they do. So really the data set size for validation depends on what the company claims that they do. So that really then drives the data set size. Whereas, you can ask many scientific questions about the same algorithm, and maybe you need more data to answer some of them. But when a company comes to the FDA with a claim, we look at that claim to help them identify the right data size.
Dr. Magnus, Professor Tschider, anything to add here about how the volume of data for AI might change things?
I have a caveat or a concern, which I think was expressed well by Alex London in the talk earlier today, which is I do think, I think there's this weird thing that happens where people forget that no matter how much data you throw at machine learning, this is all still observational data. And so it's not the same as clinical or controlled data. And I do think that that's really important to note. And sometimes even the language we use about validation, which technically is correct, can be misleading to clinicians who aren't in the field about what it really means, because it could be perfectly valid for a particular data set, even a robust one, but because there could be confounding things, you can get results that show that it's better to be asthmatic. Being asthmatic is protective of hospitalization from influenza and things like that. And that's not, people tend to say when they see things like that, there must have been a problem, but it isn't a problem. It's just a fact about the fact that these are ultimately just very big sets of observations. And so I do think we have to just be aware of that. And then we also have to recognize that the implementation in clinical practice is going to wind up being mediated by real people, and that what they do and how they do it, if they have the same tool, but for some patients they listen to it and other patients they don't, you could wind up having quite differential impacts. And even the example earlier of the triage FDA device, some devices like that have been developed that were designed to save clinician time by flagging the images that needed to be focused on, wound up taking more time, because since the AI saw something, then there must be something there, even if there's a lot of false positives. And then the result of that is, instead of being a time-saving device, it turns out to be a time-wasting device. So the actual way things get implemented may not be at all what you expected. And so I do think we have to continue to evaluate and study what really happens in the real-world settings.
I'll just add that all data are contextual. And what you need and to what extent you need it and how much of it you need it is really dependent on the problem you're trying to solve. And I think that there's a tendency to say, let's look at the data to figure out if this is any good. And I don't know that that's the right approach. I think it's more about, how did you select the data? What are the populations you're thinking about? What is your indicated use? What is your planned label? All of these things matter a lot in terms of data selection. And I think that those are actually much more useful pieces of information than just having a data set sort of available to you. But I do think that there could be a role here somewhere for peer review or for third-party review to kind of look at the approach and validate it without having to disclose the data itself. We've done something similar with de-identification and anonymization expert determination, where you don't necessarily need to see the data, but you do need to know what somebody's trying to do with the data. And ultimately what data types, what data elements are being selected and in what frequencies. So, there's something probably to be said for that too.
But again, I'd emphasize Alex's point. We need more clinical trials to see how the machine learning does against standard practice. And I would say pragmatic clinical trials rather than idealized trials, so we can see in the real world setting, does this really work as well or better or worse than what we're already doing?
100%. And I think that there is an argument here for, post-market review or post-market use. And maybe there's something here that more clearly follows what we've seen with vaccines, potentially. A little bit more monitoring later in the game would be good.
Yeah, completely agree.
Well, do we have time to end with one last question for Dr. Magnus? I see. Okay. I'm seeing clapping, which I think means yes. We have one very quick question. So the very quick question for you, Dr. Magnus, I'd like to close with, I think your point about the asymmetry, the systems and populations that are at the core of healthcare doctor, a dichotomous core doctor-patient relationship, I think is very fascinating. And I would like to give you an opportunity to get kind of patient-centric here, which is, what do you think patients need? What tools do you think they need to have when they're interacting with AI in a healthcare setting to be able to have a successful interaction?
Wow, you said a quick question.
One word.
More. more than they have now. I mean, the biggest problem right now, and we see this in a whole range of topics, and we've actually been studying this, is that there's so many misunderstandings about the nature of clinical practice and assumptions and beliefs that patients have that are incorrect. And it takes a huge amount of effort to educate them about the reality. So they're mostly ignorant about the factors that drive clinician behavior. They don't understand the extent to which physicians tend to not individuate their prescribing habits and things like that. So there's just so much that they don't understand now. This is just one more thing they don't understand on top of a whole range of other things that they don't understand going in there. So I think we need to do a much better job of transparency and educating people about the nature of what's really going on in clinical care.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Sorry if I set you up for a big question, not in a short amount of time. Well, thank you to all the panelists. And I think with that, we will close this session. And I think next on the agenda is a break. So thank you everyone for dialing in.